Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you and welcome to the Elire Strategy Summit. We're really excited to host you guys over the next 2 days, and this is the Prioritizing Project Management, a case study. My name is Katie Bolt, and I'm the Business Development Associate here at Elire, and I'm one of the moderators you will hear throughout the event. Before we get into the presentation today, I should have a couple of housekeeping items. Everyone is going to be placed on mute for the duration of the presentation. There's going to be 2 poll questions throughout the presentation. We would love your participation. If time allows, we will have a live Q&A at the end, and please submit all your questions through the Q&A portal at the bottom of your screen. Also, a reminder, this is eligible for PMI PDU credits, and certifications will be sent out upon request after the event. It's for 1 PDU credit hour. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Michael, to kick it off.
Thank you so much, Katie, and thank you for the reminder on those all-important credits. And welcome, as everyone said, as Katie said, to Prioritizing Project Management, a case study. And one of the things we'll be doing today is not only looking at best practices, but also looking at tools. And that's something that is a common theme of all of the presentations over the 2-day Elire Strategy Summit, is we not only want to give you theory, but we want to give you tools to put theory into practice. And these are tools that you can use to manage any type of project, whether it's a people, technology, or process project. And I would actually argue that all projects have elements of people, technology, and process. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So first, let's take a quick look at the agenda. We're going to be going through those project management best practices and also the toolkit, because again, it's one thing to talk about theory. It's another thing to actually have tools where you can put theory into use. After that, we'll be talking at an increasingly important topic, which is the role of soft skills in project management. After that, we'll look at a brief case study on how to take your project from red to green, using some of the best practices and tools that we've discussed over the course of the next hour. And finally, key takeaways. It's really those elements that you can use to set the foundation for a successful project. And as Katie mentioned, there will be a live Q&A as time permits at the end. Please feel free to submit your questions, and we will get to those at the end of the session. So first, let me introduce myself. My name is Michael Merrill. I'm a partner and co-CEO here at Elire. I have almost 25 years of guiding the strategy on people, technology, and process, and over 20 years of project management experience. And that ranges from small projects that might be quite focused and narrow in scope to large multinational projects. And as I mentioned earlier, I think all projects, regardless of whether they are small and focused and narrow or large and multinational, have elements of people, technology, and process. Now, some of them obviously may have the main driver be that it's a technology transformation project. But there are certainly elements of people and process that go along with that, because none of those 3 things operate within a vacuum. They all operate together. And at the end of the day, the role of a successful project manager is to make sure that all 3 of these things cross the finish line together. If the technology is ready, but the underlying business processes that live outside of the technology are not ready, or if the people who use that technology to complete a business process are not ready, then something has missed the mark. So the goal of today is to really talk about how all 3 of those can come together through successful project management best practices and a toolkit. So a little about Elire. As you may have learned in some of the other sessions, if you participated in some of the other wonderful sessions today on day 1 of the Elire Strategy Summit, we were established in 2005, and we're celebrating 15, almost 16 years of successful business. And at the end of the day, Elire is all about really partnering with our clients to help them implement, integrate, optimize, and upgrade their software investments. And really, at the end of the day, we really want to provide strategic guidance so that we can assist with best practice core business process improvement so that we can unlock the power of those software investments. Again, technology and software don't live within a vacuum. They live within greater business processes. And of course, they only come to life when people are involved. So it's really bringing all three of those together. You've already heard several wonderful presentations today from our management advisory services practice here at Elire, and they can help you with application roadmaps if you're unsure if you should select vendor A or vendor B, or if you're not even sure how to get started with that process. They can also help you with business process improvement and transformation, whether large or small. And of course, that also generally brings with it end user adoption and change management, data analytics and visualization, and project management. And over the next 2 days, we have lots of sessions over these various topics. And whenever I talk about one of those topics today, I'll be sure to call out the upcoming session that is related. So with that, let's turn our attention to agenda item 1, which is the project management best practices and toolkit. Now, many of you know that projects have a tendency to fall into what we call pitfalls. I'm a child of the 80s, so I always think back to the classic sort of 16 or 8 pixel video game Pitfall, where the object was to jump over or leap over obstacles and to use your skills and expertise and hopefully not get caught. Here you can see, unfortunately, the poor soul is falling into the pitfall. And what we really want to do is talk today about project management best practices. And there are really 3 things that you should always ensure are in place to avoid those common pitfalls. The first is project communications. All projects really depend on strong project communications, whether it's ensuring that every single person on the team knows their roles and responsibilities, or knows what's happening over the next 6 to 10 to 12 weeks of the project, or if it's communications to the broader user base that's actually impacted by the end result of the project. And of course, it's also ensuring that everyone from project leadership is aware of what's happening. The second item are internal controls. Most projects really have the mantra of trying to stay on time, on target, on budget. But there are other project controls that are also very important to look at, such as change management, impact, and risk. So we're going to be looking at a variety of tools that can really help you stay on target and track in the conventional sense in terms of timeline and budget, but also to help you stay on track in terms of impact and risk and some other key elements. And finally, the third common item that you can use to avoid common pitfalls is really leadership oversight, really ensuring that your leaders are heavily invested in the project, know what's going on, and are providing thoughtful and effective oversight is absolutely key. These projects can be very transformational for an organization, and if they operate within sort of a small corner of the organization, then they won't necessarily be as successful as if they're championed by someone in the executive suite who can really help ensure that everyone is coming together, working towards a common goal. But it's easy to talk about these 3 things. Oh, of course, we need great project communications. Duh. Of course, we need internal project controls. And of course, we need leadership oversight. It's easy to say, but it's hard to do. So the purpose of today is to really look at the management toolkit and how you can bring those 3 things to life. And we'll be looking at 3 sets of tools. Elire has lots of tools that cover all phases of a project, but in the interest of time, we wanted to focus on 3 critical areas. 1 is pre-mobilization. It's those tools that you use before your project starts to help ensure the project gets off on a strong and steady footing. The second is mobilization tools, and those can be used in the first week or weeks to help ensure that everything is moving according to plan. And finally, execution tools that can be used every day, every week, every month throughout the course of a project to stay on target and on track. So we're going to deep dive into each of these 3 areas. But first, we're going to ask a poll question.
Thank you, Michael. So the first poll question is going to be, which project management tools does your organization currently use? If you use multiple of these, you can feel free to select as many as you want. We'll give about 30 seconds to answer here. About 10 more seconds. There's still votes rolling in. And I'll end it here. So kind of all over the board, Michael. With a bunch, I mean, the biggest percentage people are using project plans. The second percentage would be project charters. So thank you guys so much.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. And that is great information. And I'll be referring back to that throughout the course of the presentation. And it's wonderful to see so many of these tools in place. And I hope to provide some tips and techniques that maybe can take your use of those tools to the next level. So first, let's look at the pre-mobilization tools or pre-project tools. And the two tools that we want to cover today, and again, these are just two amongst many tools, are the project charter and also a communication strategy and structure. Now, the project charter, this is basically the elevator pitch for your project. It's what you want team members to say when they're asked. Someone walks up to John and says, hey, I hear you're working on this new project. What exactly is going on over there? And that's the role of the project charter. And everything that I'm going to talk about over the next few minutes is really just reinforcing the message that you heard earlier today during the strategy session, overcoming problems leaders are faced with today. And in that session, we talked about the importance of using project charters to communicate. But if you happen to miss that session earlier today, we're going to hit some highlights. So as mentioned earlier, Elire definitely believes in establishing strong project charters to really gain alignment and serve as an introduction to the project. Remember, it serves as that elevator pitch. It's what people are supposed to say when asked what's going on. And remember, those people can be team members, they could be project sponsors or executives, but it's important to make sure that everyone is staying on the same page, communicating the same message. And as mentioned earlier, project charters should be short and easy to consume. We do not believe in project charters that are 40, 50, 60 pages long that tend to gather dust and sort of sit on a shelf. The goal is really to have short project charters. We like to have 1 pages front and back, and they should really outline all of the key information on a project. For example, you can have the project definition or project statement to really explain the background of the project. And here is just a common example. You saw another one in the session earlier where we can have just a simple couple of sentences. It doesn't have to be pages long to explain what's going on with the project. And then also a list of key objectives and guiding principles. Now, some of the interesting things that we often like to do is throw in background. You know, what's happened in the organization over the last couple of years that led to the decision to make this change? Again, whether it's a process change, a technology change, or a system change. And I see Q&As are starting to come in, and we will definitely field those as we get going. Katie will take note of those. And then down here, we have goals and guiding principles. And again, the key here is to make sure that everyone is communicating the same message whenever asked what's going on with that project. Now, other things that could also be done are the identification of key stakeholders and the project sponsors, and also a high-level timeline with the key phases highlighted, and maybe the definition of the phases. You know, it's important for people in an organization to know who are the key stakeholders, because when you think of an organization, you want to know who at the top of your particular column within the organization you should go to ask questions about this project. And it's also important to know that the stakeholders represent a vast and diverse group across the organization, as appropriate, of course. Some projects are larger than others, but you really want to make sure that if there are a diverse set of stakeholders, they're represented, because what does that do? It provides confidence to the organization that all of the different voices from all of the different parts of the organization are being heard. And that's important. And then, of course, understanding the timeline. Not only when are you going live, but when might I, as a user, get training? Things like that would be of interest. Now, the next item that we want to talk about is really project communication strategy. And we're going to spend a couple of minutes on this. And it's important to remember that having the right communication modality for the right circumstance is essential. This is not a one-size-fits-all approach, and it shouldn't be, right? People consume information in different ways. Different elements of your population have different needs. Some people are heavy users, some people are light users, etc. But ultimately, a communication strategy should really be developed during the pre-mobilization and early planning stages. And again, remember, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Now, the goal should always be to inform, right? That makes sense. We're communicating, so we want to inform. Who do we want to inform? We want to inform team members, stakeholders, project sponsors, really everyone. So it's important to think of the different types of communications that might be required for those different audiences. Now, communication should also be frequent. It should be appropriately consistent and contain relevant information. Too much information and people will burn out on the communications. Too little and they'll start to worry. They'll wonder, what is going to happen to me? When am I going to find out what's going to happen to me? And then also, some people make the mistake of having lots of communications at the beginning with the kickoff, and then lots of communications at the very, very end when it's time to go live. But it's important to communicate throughout the course of the project. And that was a big message in a session earlier today, where it's all about reinforcing the message. So you really want to communicate frequently to reinforce those messages as the project changes over time. Now, the strategy should also build awareness, desire, knowledge, and acceptance of all of those changes that are being brought about. Remember, this project is transforming you from a current state that may or may not be working to a future state that is more ideal. As a part of that, that involves change, and change always has to be managed. Sometimes change is small, sometimes change is big. And it's important to know the difference. And it's important to be proactive and timely around those change communications to the broader user base. We tend to find that when people don't know what's going on, people start to worry, they start to stress out. It's only natural. So it's important to put mechanisms in place to really gauge the level of change. Is this a big change from the current state to the future state, or is it a small change from the current state to the future state? And depending upon that level of change, that should really guide the level of communications that you need. One of the earlier sessions talked about the importance of change champions. And the higher the level of change, the more you might need change champions from an individual area. Now, to really learn everything about implementing change, I invite all of you to attend the session that's going to be right after this one today. It's the 5th and final session of day 1 of the Elire Strategy Summit. And it's all about building a successful change management strategy, expanding and accelerating user adoption, and it's going to follow this. And you can see that a link is currently being dropped so that you can register for that if you've not registered for it already. So let's keep going and talking about project communications. We talked a little bit about strategy. Now let's talk about structure, because that's how we implement the strategy, right? And an important part of structure is really empowering your team to make decisions. And we're big believers in tiered project meetings to really ensure effective and efficient communications. Now, we know that you definitely have to have the big all hands project team meetings, but we would argue that those should really just be for general communications and general updates. If you find that you're pulling your 20-person team, or maybe your 60, 80, or 100-person team together, and you're going work stream by work stream by work stream, issue by issue by issue, you may find that at any given point in time, 75 or 80% of the participants aren't necessarily needing to hear that level of detail on that particular topic. And what you may be falling into a common trap of is, sort of blocking people's time when they could be at their desk doing heads down work. And that was another of the key messages from one of the earlier sessions. So be aware of that. But if you're not going to be reviewing all of that in these big project team meetings, if those are really for just the big communications about moving from one phase to the next or to general project updates, when do you cover everything else? Well, we would argue that you do a series of tiered meetings. You organize your project by team or work stream, and those meet regularly. And then each of the leads of the work streams meet as part of a project leads meeting, and then you can have a series of steering committees. But how does this work really? So think about it in terms of a pyramid. And we really want people at the lowest levels of the pyramid to really be empowered to make decisions. If something is a high benefit and low cost, they should have more authority to make those decisions. And as complexity rises, as cost rises, or if consensus is unable to be reached, then it's time to move up the pyramid. So at the bottom, we have those project team or work stream meetings. And that's really where the detailed status should be reviewed, where you're looking at essential RAID items. If RAID is an unfamiliar term, we'll be talking a lot about that in just a few minutes, so just be patient. And then the project leadership meeting is, again, all of those essential workstream leaders. They come together and you can talk about cross workstream issues. You don't need everyone in that meeting. You just need the workstream leaders. That way you can be effective and efficient. And then finally, steering committees. And we often will have two types of steering committees, again, depending upon the size and complexity of the project. If it's a rather large, complex project, we will bring all of the accountables from the RACI together into an operational steering committee. Now, the accountables are the business process owners. And again, if RACI is an unfamiliar term, just be on note that we're going to be covering that in just a few minutes. But all of those key accountables coming together in an operational steering committee can be very effective to help ensure that the business process owners are in close communication and that consensus is being maintained throughout the course of the project. One of the earlier topics talked a lot about stakeholder engagement, and this is one of the best ways to accomplish that. And then, of course, the final executive steering committee, which has the ultimate project sponsors and governance for those issues when consensus can't be reached earlier at a lower level, or if it's terribly risky or terribly impactful. Now, another thing that we'd like people to consider are really two types of meetings to help keep your project on track. So we talked about other types of meetings, but there's a few more. And one is a phase kickoff meeting. Now, this isn't a project kickoff meeting, although we'd certainly encourage one at the beginning of the project, but it's a phase kickoff meeting. And this should happen before all of the phases. Too many projects we find have a huge kickoff at the beginning, 120 people, and they describe everything that's going to happen over a 12-month project. Most people can't retain all of that. Remember, people are busy with other responsibilities. We think phase kickoffs are much more effective because you can bring people in and talk about the next 6 to 8 to 10 weeks, the who, what, why, when, and how, key deliverables, timelines, milestones, etc., giving people what they need to know over the next very short-term period. And another, this is again reinforcing that message that was heard earlier in overcoming problems leaders are facing today. And another meeting are gate reviews. You know, most projects have phases, right? They have a design phase, a build phase, a test phase, etc. And too many projects tend to sort of slide downhill. Oh, it's May 1st. It's time to begin build. It's April 15th. It's time to begin, test or whatever. And we really think it's important at each of the phases to really review the entrance and exit criteria to make sure you're effectively leaving one phase and effectively entering the next phase. And if gate criteria isn't met, that's when it's time to bring in the operational and executive steering committees and start to make some decisions. So with that, let's move to the next series of tools. And I see that questions are continuing to come in. We will definitely be getting to those at the end of the session. But the next series of tools are the RACI. Remember, I mentioned that earlier, and project plan and resource capacity. So let's dive into these. So at the end of the day, if you don't have the right people in the room, then you're not going to have an effective and efficient meeting. How many of us have been in a meeting where you ask yourself, what am I doing here? Or what is Joan or Jack doing here? This doesn't involve them at all. Or how are we ever going to make this decision if Susan isn't involved and Susan isn't even invited? So that all comes down to the RACI, and it's all about identifying all of the key roles, and it's used to clarify the roles and the responsibilities to ultimately ensure that the right people are in the meeting and participating. And it really can help you define who should be involved during all phases of the project: fit gap, design, build, testing, and training. So what does it stand for? It's an acronym. So the R stands for responsible, people who do the work, facilitate it, and or organize it. Those are the doers. We definitely have the accountable, which is the A. Those are the ones who make the decision-making authority. They have the yes or no. The buck stops here. And we generally recommend that there is one decision-making authority with each. And then the consulted and the informed are slightly different. The consulted are people who need to be involved before a decision is locked down, and informed is they can be informed after the fact. So the responsibles and the accountables are really in the room, sleeves rolled up, and they're really doing all of the work. The consulted needs to be part of that decision, but they can really review it once it's baked a little, right? They have critical expertise. They're an impacted upstream or downstream system, and they can contribute before that decision is made. And then the informed are people who are highly impacted, but they don't need to know before the decision is made. They really just need to know before you implement. So after the decision, but before the implementation. So we often say that, the responsibles and accountables are the required meeting attendees. The consultant is the optional, and then the informed shouldn't be there. If you walk into a room and you're like, why are 30 people sitting here? We only need 4 or 5. It may be because you didn't effectively define the RACI, or maybe you did define the RACI, but you didn't stick by it when you were actually sending out your meeting invites. If someone is in the informed category and keeps raising their hand and saying, I should really be a part of this, maybe they need to be moved over to the consulted, but be thoughtful about that, because the informed will eventually know. They just will know after the decision. So let's talk about the next topic, which is project planning and resource capacity. And this is something Elire spends a lot of time on our projects. And we believe it's important to go beyond project planning and to really deep dive into resource capacity analysis. Now, what do I mean by that? So ultimately, it's understanding if team members can complete assigned work within a milestone. That's essential, right? That's the whole purpose of project management. And we all know the basics. A project plan should be developed, and it should include key milestones, and certainly those key tasks and critical dependencies should be in there. But one thing that people often mess up on, a common pitfall, is that they don't have the appropriate level for the culture of the organization. I've been a part of projects. I can think of one at the very beginning of my career back in the mid-90s, where the project plan was literally in the tens and tens and tens of thousands. It may have been 20 or 30,000 lines long. And the idea or goal was to try to capture every single task down to like 15-minute increments. And obviously that project plan became unwieldy and very difficult for anyone to consume or understand. So it's important to understand the appropriate level for the culture of your organization, and also for the type of resources who are involved. But more importantly, we also like to look at resource capacity. Now, resource capacity is more than doing a fully baseline project in Microsoft Project. Resource capacity, we think, goes sort of beyond that. And there's a couple of do's and don'ts that we like to point out to help you avoid common pitfalls. So it should absolutely include all of your key FTEs, both client and consultant, and it should really be loaded with consideration of meeting and administrative downtime, downtime to support non-project activities or PTO. Obviously, people are spending only a portion of their time on your project. You'd like it if they spent 100% of the time, but it's often not realistic. They often have other project responsibilities outside of yours, or they just have meeting and administrative downtime. And at the end of the day, what we like to do is to really understand the number of hours that a resource can do heads down work each week. And that's critical. And that's what we plug into our resource capacities. Some people can do 30 hours a week. Some people can do 10 or 15. We almost never put someone in at 40. And that's because there's always meeting and administrative downtime, right? Even for your consultants, you might be thinking, well, I'm paying my consultants 40 hours a week. I want them to do 40 hours worth of work. Well, the problem is if you put them in all of your plans, or you put anyone in at sort of 40 hours a week, and then you fill in your project plan and you say, oh, this is an 8-hour task. It's supposed to start today and finish 8 hours later. And then you go and check on that person and they're like, oh, I didn't have time. I was pulled into this meeting. I was pulled into that meeting. I had these other project responsibilities. There can be two approaches that are taken. One, which we think is not necessarily the right approach, which is then to put in every single meeting and every single distraction into your project plan so that you can account for the 40 hours. And again, we think that's what can spin you back towards those unwieldy plans that become a little unrealistic. We think the better approach is to sort of scale back and really consider heads down time. So if someone has, 30 hours available a week and they're going to be on the project for 10 weeks, that's 300 hours that resource has available to them. When you then assign tasks to that resource, are you above that 300 hours? Are you below that 300 hours? And then how are you monitoring that week over week? And that's something that we think is really important. And we call that sort of capacity dashboard analysis. So understanding how much work is assigned to a resource and that resource's weekly burn down is essential. So think of it in terms of, again, our situation where someone has 30 hours a week in 10 weeks, which is 300 hours. You then assign maybe 290 or 300 or 310 hours, something within the realm of 300. And then you monitor it. If you think they can spend 30 hours a week on the project, you get through week one, and has 30 hours of work been accomplished, yes or no? If not, you may need to revisit some of your key assumptions. So what we often do is do very detailed capacity analysis where we look day over day, week over week at how much is been assigned to a resource and how much capacity that resource has. And then we use simple analytics in Excel or Smartsheet or other project planning tools to create burn down rates. And that can be sort of a game changer because then you can easily move things around from one resource or one work stream to another as appropriate. And of course, if you're not hitting your trend lines on a consistent and regular basis, then it begins to raise a flag that needs to be part of the status report that we'll be talking about a little bit later. Now, capacity analysis can also play out in a whole host of other things, like system test dashboards, design dashboards, build dashboards. There's always these dashboards where tasks or key activities need to be completed. And we like to think of those as units of work that need to be completed within a certain time frame. Those units of work take X number of hours. They're assigned to X number of people. Those people have X number of hours. So at that point, it becomes sort of a math game. Are we getting what we need from these resources? If not, we need to work with our managers, reassign priorities, reassign workloads, etc. Or we may need to revisit milestones and timelines because maybe the original assumptions were not what they should have been. So those are just some thoughts and tips on project planning and resource capacity. So I want to expand that just a little bit because I think it's important to think of things not only in terms of priority, which is where most organizations stop, right? How important is this or how complex is this? And I talked about this at the beginning of the presentation, but we'd like to examine 4 key elements to, again, help you avoid pitfalls. Priority, complexity, impact, and risk. And really having a solid understanding of resource capacity lets you effectively and efficiently manage your resources across these different categories. Priority, of course, as capacity opens up on your project, things that were sort of out of scope, but the next tier priority items can be brought into scope. If capacity is shrinking, then those lowest priority items might need to be moved out of scope for this phase and put into the next phase. So really understanding the priority of scope items, both in and out of scope, is essential. Complexity, because you really want to balance your workloads, was one resource giving all of the ridiculously complex tasks and another resource giving all of the easy tasks. Should you balance that? Is it too much on one person's plate? And is it, introducing too much risk? The next is impact. As discussed earlier, higher impact items require more change management. And what does that mean? It means time. It means, additional capacity that's going to have to be consumed later on. So really staying on top of those high impact items can help ensure that you're not estimating training and change management downstream. And risk can help you really stay on top of sort of testing estimates, because things that are higher risk require more consensus building up front. So maybe design is going to take longer, or they might take more time downstream because you'll be testing more scenarios. So I would encourage everyone to go beyond priority and complexity and to really bring in impact and risk. Those will help ensure that, remember, at the end of the day, the people, the technology, and the process all cross the finish line together. Impact brings in the people, and then of course risk, you're testing out the risk, right? Testing out the risk of the business process, testing out the risk of the system. So if you'd like to learn more about testing, we have a wonderful session that is scheduled for tomorrow at 1 p.m. Central. Testing strategies, how to define them, and how to use end-to-end testing to ensure success. It's going to be a great session, and I highly encourage all of you to attend. And you can see the link is being put in the dropdown. So let's move into our final section, which is execution tools. We're going to talk about three: the GRIPI, the RAID log, and the status report. And I see some people are asking about these acronyms, and we will be doing deep dives into the acronyms and really sort of explaining what each of them stand for. So by the end of the presentation, you have a solid understanding of them. Let's start with the first, which is the GRIPI. And the more complex the topic that you're about to cover, the more essential a GRIPI. And GRIPI is really a 4-step sort of project planning tool that we like to think of as an agenda on steroids. And it can really help ensure effective meetings. Remember the example earlier where people were in a meeting and they wondered what they were even doing there? Well, the other thing is maybe you reach the end of an hour-long meeting and you're like, what was discussed? What decisions were made? That was a complete waste of time. So that's where the GRIPI comes in. And we suggest one is create it. It can be done in Word, and then it can be included in your email, in your actual calendar invite, or it can even be put into a PowerPoint to kick off a meeting. So what does GRIPI stand for? The G stands for goals, and it's the goal of the meeting. What did you bring these people together to decide? When we reach the end of this hour or 2 hours, we want to know X. You may think that everyone knows the goal, but you'd be surprised. And you can really help ensure that everyone is on the same page and that you have stakeholder alignment by really mapping out the goal. The next are the roles. Who was invited to the meeting? This is where your RACI comes into play. Reference back to it. It's a great tool. The responsible and the accountable. Remember, that's the R and the A. Those should be required. The C should be optional, unless it's the final meeting when that final decision is being validated. And then, of course, the I comes in later. But it really lets people know what is expected of them in this meeting. How many times have you just shown up to a meeting, you have no idea what's being talked about, and you have no idea what your role is in the meeting? So this helps define that. The next is the process. What process are you going to reach during the course of the meeting to achieve the goal? Now, again, some meetings are simple, and this might seem like overkill, but as it says at the top, the more complex the topic that's covered, the more essential the GRIPI. So maybe the order of activities is starting with a brainstorming session and then moving on to a dot voting session where you dot vote the various brainstorming ideas, and then you move on from there and there and there. And really having a clear outline of a process will help keep your meeting on track And at the end of the day, people will say, that was such a well-facilitated meeting. We did that so effectively and so efficiently. And finally, interpersonal agreements. That's the I, GRPI, goals, roles, process, and interpersonal, GRIPI. GRIPI is all about the communication rules of the road to establish trust, open communications, and really help ensure that everyone's treating each other respectfully. And we always like to go through some examples of interpersonal. It sounds a little, touchy-feely, but I am a firm believer in interpersonal agreements, especially when you have more complex or controversial topics. And I'm going to go through a couple of these, and you'll find that when these are really embraced by your team, people will start calling these out. We've all been in meetings where there's an issue with one conversation. The famous sidebar at the end of the table where two people start chatting on their own, other people feel uncomfortable. There's a tendency to maybe make a comment like, what are you guys talking about? You need to pay attention. That can be uncomfortable. So instead, we lay down the idea of one conversation. And that basically gives permission for anyone in the meeting to say one conversation without any sort of negative intention beyond simply saying one conversation, and it brings everyone back together. Other things are promoting shared ownership. Everyone is in this together, assuming positive intent. Now, when we deal with processes going from a broken current state, or maybe a less effective or less efficient current state, to a more improved future state, we're going to be dealing with issues and problems. Some of the people in the room may have helped design the current state. There may be two departments in the room that blame each other for data issues, things like that. The idea behind assume positive intent is really to assume that all of these people have been selected to participate in the meeting with the goal of getting to that ideal future state. So although someone might point out something that's not working today, they're not doing it necessarily to poke a finger, but they're doing it to sort of light the way to the future. Parking lots can help save a project from going, off on a tangent. And again, like one conversation, someone can simply say parking lot, and that generally brings the topic to an end, and the scribe can record it and you can move on. Everyone has a voice and perspectives to share. You may be in a meeting that has team members and managers and directors and executives, and it's important for each person to have their voice, recognized and valued, because remember, they were part of the RACI. That's why they're in the meeting. 80-20, so many meetings can be derailed because someone wants to talk about that one thing that happened 2 years ago. It's not happened since, but it happened 2 years ago, and I have the best 20-minute story about it. Well, at the end of the 20 minutes, you only have a few minutes left in your 30-minute meeting, so nothing gets accomplished. So use the 80-20 rule. One conversation, I've already talked about, and then go to the source. Make sure that you're really, going to the actual source. So the RAID log, this is another great tool. And again, it's another acronym, and it stands for risks. It's those items that need to be, properly managed to make sure they don't turn into issues. The actions, which are critical, project critical tasks that must be completed to ensure project timelines and milestones stay on track. The issues, which everyone knows what an issue is, right? And most people stop at an issues log. And the idea here is to go beyond the issues log and tackle a RAID log. Go beyond the issues is sort of the message. And then decisions. The idea here is to track those key risks, key action items, key issues, and key decisions that are preventing the project from moving forward in some way, shape, or form. So don't simply think of issues on your logging mechanism. Consider the risks and make sure you're including mitigation strategies. Consider key action items that are blocking progress from being made. That's not every action on a project, it's only the critical actions. And then of course, key or critical decisions that might need to go up to steering or governance. Now, obviously all items should be well documented, have an assigned resource, priority, and target date. And of course, review as necessary in the tiered meeting that were referenced earlier. And that brings us to our final topic, which is sort of status report template. And make sure you're producing something that's easy to consume. If it's not easy to consume, you might be missing the mark, and it should have critical information only. And you should really use work streams and threads to build this status report over the course of the week. Work streams develop their own status reports, which in turn roll to the consolidated status. And then, of course, decisions that are required from steering should always include positive and negative and be sent out in advance. So that brings us to our next poll question. What are you worried about? And Katie?
Thanks, Michael. So last poll question is, what is your top concern with your projects? Scope, resources, timeline, or budget? We'll give about 20 seconds.
And some of you may be trying to click all four, but simply think of the one that is your top concern.
And I'm going to close it out here. So it looks like the two top concerns are resources and scope.
Thank you, Katie. So that's great. So I'm glad I spent some extra time on that resource capacity analysis, because that's obviously a big concern of individual participants today. So how do we manage these on the status report? And we have a standard template that divides into a series of sections. We have our top section, which is all about reflecting the overall project and status. You know, if the budget is green, the resources are green, the timeline and scope are green, then the project is green. And then that middle section looks at those individual items. Budget should definitely include an assessment if the weekly forecasted burn rate is in line or out of line with the budget. Resources should can include any sort of concerns around, you know, that capacity that we talked about, and if the burn down rates are being achieved. And then, of course, timeline and scope, it's all about, you know, really understanding if these key milestones are being achieved. And of course, scope should really talk about if something is falling inside or outside of original scope estimates by a certain amount, because it might need to go up and get approval. Key milestones, this should not replace the project plan. It should not be hundreds of lines long. It should just be really those key snapshots. Remember, this is being consumed by stakeholders, by executives, and they should be able to quickly see what was just accomplished and what's coming up and what's the status. Is it on track? Is it off track? And again, the RAID, not your entire RAID log, but critical items that you really want executives to know about, or stakeholders to know about, or team members to know about. And then, of course, at the bottom, you can do our wonderful rolling snapshot. You know, if the project was green, green, yellow, red, yellow, green, you want to know about it. So those different sections of the status report can really help you ensure that it's an easy to consume snapshot, providing critical information only. If it's not easy to consume, people won't consume it, and you'll be missing the part of communications. So I want to quickly talk about sort of soft skills in project management. They really are more important than ever. You know, communication, we really encourage the leveraging of Slack and Microsoft Teams. Basically avoid email. I'm in meetings all the time where we chat with someone to get their perspective, or maybe now we add them to a Zoom meeting to get their perspective. You know, rather than saying, oh, so-and-so is not here, let's invite them to the next meeting, try to pull them in immediately. And then, of course, use status reports and critical communications to really keep everyone in line and on track. Connection, you know, projects are difficult. We really want one-on-one interaction, team social hours, casual team chat and messaging, really break down the barriers. So many projects are dealing with teams where there's an us against them mentality, and it's important to establish connection and break that down so that everyone can be marching towards the same goal. Time management, you know, this is really making sure that meetings aren't 60 minutes. Meetings are only 45 or 50 minutes, so that you can give someone time to quickly check their email, get to the next meeting, block heads down time on your calendar. And then, of course, make sure that only critical people from your RACI are involved and you're not sort of wasting other people's time. And then, of course, adaptability. When things go wrong, really be open and transparent to the greatest extent possible. You know, what you don't know, what you're doing to get answers, etc. And next, a quick case study going from red to green. So we were invited in by Texas Christian University, a higher ed client. They purchased a page-up system with several modules from recruiting and LMS and onboarding. They purchased licenses, and they also paid for upfront technical and functional help, but excluded project management. And of course, things started to go off the track. So they required a project manager who had expertise and could really come in and help, through all of the critical elements of the project. So Elire came to the table, and we were able to step in and create a detailed and well-organized project plan, because people need to know what's going on and what they're responsible for. Timely completion of all tasks was really monitored using all of the tools that I've talked about today. We had regular status meetings and stakeholder meetings using the tiered approach to ensure that everyone knew what they needed to know and not too much or too little. And of course, at the end of the day, the model was implemented successfully. And what that really means is that we were able to really achieve those three things of communications, internal project controls, and leadership oversight. So really the key takeaways for today, laying the foundation for a successful project, it's really regardless of the size of your project or its complexity, to really achieve those goals of project communications, internal project controls, and leadership oversight, go back and have that well-defined RACI. Make sure you're evaluating the high impact changes through some type of mechanism so you can have appropriate downstream change management. Make sure you are doing a detailed resource capacity that really focuses on heads down time. Make sure you're managing a RAID log, and that means actively managing, not opening a risk that doesn't have a mitigation strategy that's not looked at for 2 months. It can be a game changer. And of course, remember the tip about project phase kickoff meetings for the next 6 to 12 weeks, so people know the who, what, why, when, and how. And finally, those tiered status meetings. And at the end of the day, we hope all of these help you, going back to our little mantra of the 80s game guy, sort of avoid those common pitfalls so that you can jump over the crocodile pit instead of falling into it. So with that, we have just a couple of questions I see. So we have the, what are the risks of not having any steering committee? How often should they meet? I think it's very risky to not have a steering committee. You run the risk of not having stakeholder alignment, or maybe one stakeholder being aligned, but another not being aligned. And also you run the risk of not communicating if a project is going yellow or going red until too late. And then people wonder what's going on. So I think oversight of a steering committee is one of the most important things. And how often they should meet is really variable. They should meet more frequently early on, once the project gets going, to sort of lay the foundation. And then during slower times of the project, they could meet less. And at the end, they might meet more. So we always work on the cadence with the steering committee to make sure they understand. I hope that helps. The next are, what are examples of criteria for a design gate review or a test gate review? That's a great question. Testing will be covered extensively in the testing session tomorrow. So I'll focus on design. And I think there the key is, again, making sure you've got consensus amongst your stakeholders, review and sign off, really validating that design. It can't be the design of your consultant. It has to be the design that your stakeholder, your acceptable from your RACI, believes in. If your acceptable from your RACI hasn't reviewed it, then you run the risk of being off track. Another quick question is advice on accurate project status reporting. Avoid making everything green or at most yellow. I love this one. And on the prior slide, I might have jumped over it just a bit quickly, but we tend to use green. Let's say if it's on track or sort of within 10%. If it's 10 to 20% or so, we might use yellow. And if it's over 20%, we use red. And the key here is to really be open and honest and transparent. No one wants to mark anything yellow because it puts a big spotlight on their project. But the problem is, if you don't mark things as yellow, you run the risk of not communicating enough until too late and things might blow up. So I would really start from the earliest days of the project with the kickoff. And again, with every phase kickoff, really reaffirm sort of the definitions of green, yellow, and red, why they're important and why you're calling them out. Get that message out early and often, and make sure your stakeholders stand behind you so that you can say, this is a requirement to the steering committee. I hope that helps. And finally, what types of tools does Elire recommend for a project plan? Could a tool like Smartsheet work? I love that. Yes, Smartsheet can absolutely work. If you're not familiar with Smartsheet, think of it as Excel on steroids. It has actually transformed project management for so many projects, where now you can have very Microsoft project-like plans with all of the critical dependencies, et cetera, all baked into Smartsheet. But then you can also do things like link out to project management dashboards, link out to your RAID log, link out to your RACI, all within interconnected sheets, something that Microsoft Project isn't able to do. So if you don't want to go down the route of project plan, I understand that, but I would definitely look at Smartsheet. Thank you for those questions. Those were all really good. And just wrapping up, the next session is a really exciting session. It's automating processes with RPA and chatbots. This is probably one of the hottest topics in all of corporate America right now. So there's going to be some really great information, and that's going to be starting in just a few minutes. As always, you can connect with Elire on any of our social media platforms. Thank you so much and have a great day.